Ladies and gentlemen, Jung's most disturbing discovery wasn't about anger management. It was about people who never get angry and why this immunity makes them psychologically untouchable. In his clinical practice, Jung documented patients with what he called emotional impermeability. Individuals who remain completely calm when insulted, unbothered by criticism, and unaffected by others' attempts to provoke them. They never took things personally, never reacted defensively, and seemed immune to the emotional triggers that controlled everyone else. Jung called this discovery disturbing because these people didn't suppress their emotions or practice detachment. They had undergone a specific psychological transformation that made other people's behavior irrelevant to their inner state, giving them an almost supernatural level of emotional freedom. Today, I'll show you Jung's most disturbing discovery about people who never get angry, and the psychological process he believed could make anyone completely unbothered by others' actions. The case that revealed Jung's most disturbing discovery began with a patient he described in his private notes. A successful businessman who came to him in 1919, not because he was suffering but because his complete lack of emotional reactivity was making others uncomfortable. This businessman, let's call him Heinrich, had built a steel empire in post-war Germany, but his employees were terrified of him. Not because he was cruel or violent, but because nothing could anger him. Insults bounced off him. Criticism made him curious, not defensive. Betrayal interested him rather than hurt him. His wife brought him to Jung because she was convinced something was wrong. "Doctor," she said, "my husband doesn't get upset about anything. Yesterday, I told him I'd been having an affair for 6 months. He asked me questions. Was I happy? Did I need anything from him? And whether I wanted to continue our marriage or end it." But here's what Jung discovered that changed everything. Heinrich wasn't emotionally numb, he wasn't suppressing anything. He had simply learned to see his triggers as mirrors, reflecting parts of himself he hadn't fully understood. Jung called this the shadow mirror effect. Every person who angers you is showing you something about your own unconscious mind. The rude coworker who dismisses your ideas, they're reflecting your fear of being inadequate. The friend who's always late, they're mirroring your need for control. The family member who criticizes your choices, they're showing you your own self-doubt. Heinrich had mastered this principle after a devastating business betrayal 3 years earlier. His closest partner had stolen his biggest client and nearly destroyed his company. But instead of seeking revenge, Heinrich asked himself one question. What part of me is this person reflecting? The answer shocked him. His partner's greed reflected Heinrich's own suppressed fear of poverty. His partner's dishonesty mirrored Heinrich's tendency to hide his true feelings. His partner's betrayal showed Heinrich his own capacity for selfishness. By facing these shadow aspects instead of projecting them onto others, Heinrich had achieved what Jung called psychological immunity. He could see other people's behavior as information about them, not attacks on him. Jung documented this process in what he called the shadow integration protocol. When someone triggers you, instead of reacting, you ask 3 questions. What trait in this person am I judging most harshly? Where do I exhibit this same trait even in small ways? What is this trigger trying to teach me about myself? Let me show you how this works. Sarah, a marketing manager, felt constantly triggered by her colleague Tom's interruptions during meetings. Using Jung's method, she asked herself, what am I judging in Tom? His need for attention. Where do I do this? She realized she often dominated conversations when feeling insecure. What was this teaching her? That her anger at Tom was really frustration with her own attention-seeking behavior. Once Sarah owned this shadow aspect, Tom's interruptions stopped bothering her. She could see them as his insecurity, not an attack on her worth. That's the power of the shadow mirror. It transforms triggers into teachers. But Jung's research revealed something even more disturbing. The people who achieved emotional impermeability had discovered a psychological space that most humans never access. The gap between stimulus and response. Heinrich described this gap to Jung. Doctor, when someone insults me, I experience something strange. Time seems to slow down. I can see their words coming toward me, but instead of hitting me, they hover in the air. In that moment, I have a choice. Do I catch these words and make them mine? Or do I let them pass through me? Jung realized Heinrich had stumbled upon what he called the reaction gap, a psychological space where conscious choice replaces unconscious reaction. Most people experience trigger and response as one continuous event. But those with emotional impermeability had learned to insert conscious awareness between the trigger and their response. This discovery contradicted everything psychology understood about human nature. We assumed anger was automatic, that triggers inevitably led to reactions. But Jung's patients proved that with the right training, anyone could access this gap and choose their response. The technique Jung developed was deceptively simple but psychologically profound. He called it the observer protocol. When triggered, instead of immediately reacting, you step back and observe the trigger as if watching a movie. You notice the other person's words, their body language, their emotional state, but most importantly, you observe your own internal response without becoming it. Jung documented case after patients mastering this technique. Maria, a teacher, learned to observe her principal's criticism without taking it personally. Instead of becoming defensive, she could see his stress, his pressure from the school board, his own insecurities. From the observer position, she could respond with empathy rather than anger. The key insight Jung discovered was this: you are not your emotions. You are the consciousness that observes your emotions. When someone triggers anger in you, that anger is information, not identity. You can choose to act on it, examine it, or simply let it pass. Heinrich had mastered this so completely that he described feeling psychologically transparent. Other people's negativity passed through him like light through glass. He wasn't avoiding or suppressing anything, he was simply choosing not to identify with every emotional impulse. But here's what Chin found most disturbing about this ability. Once people developed it, they often lost interest in the drama that consumed most humans. They stopped caring about being right, winning arguments, or proving their worth. This made them incredibly powerful, but also isolated them from those still trapped in reactive patterns. The observer protocol requires practice, but Jung found that most people could access the reaction gap within weeks of consistent application. The technique involves 3 steps. Pause when triggered and take a conscious breath. Observe the trigger and your response without judgment. Choose your action based on your values, not your impulses. This isn't about becoming emotionless or detached. It's about becoming the author of your responses rather than the victim of your reactions. Jung's research into emotional impermeability revealed another disturbing pattern. People who never got angry had built what he called boundary fortresses around their psychological space. Unlike physical boundaries, these were invisible barriers that determined what could and couldn't affect their inner state. Heinrich explained his boundary fortress to Jung. Doctor, I learned that people can only disturb my peace if I give them permission. Their words, their actions, their emotions, these are external events. They only become internal experiences if I choose to internalize them. This concept revolutionized his understanding of human psychology. Most people, he realized, had completely permeable psychological boundaries. They absorb other people's emotions, took on their stress, and allowed external events to dictate their internal state. But those with emotional impermeability had learned to construct selective barriers. Jung documented 3 types of psychological boundaries his immune patients had developed. The first was the relevance filter. They had trained themselves to only absorb information that served their growth or goals. Everything else was acknowledged but not internalized. The second was the ownership boundary. They could distinguish between their emotions and other people's emotions. When someone was angry at them, they could see it as that person's anger, not their anger about that person's anger. The third was the identity fortress. They had such a solid sense of self that external criticism couldn't shake their core identity. They could hear feedback without hearing judgment of their worth. But Jung discovered something disturbing about these boundaries. People who developed them often became magnets for those who lacked them. Toxic individuals, energy vampires, and emotionally unstable people were drawn to those with strong boundaries, because they provided the stability these chaotic personalities craved. Heinrich experienced this constantly. Doctor, he told Jung, ever since I stopped reacting to provocation, people seem to work harder to provoke me. It's as if my calm disturbs them more than anger ever could. Jung realized this was because emotionally reactive people use others' reactions to regulate their own emotional state. When Heinrich refused to provide that regulation, it forced others to confront their own psychological instability. The boundary fortress technique Jung developed involved 3 strategic elements. First, the emotional firewall. Before entering any social situation, you consciously decide which emotions you're willing to experience and which you'll observe but not absorb. Second, the response selection. You pre-decide how you'll handle common triggers. Instead of reacting the moment, you're executing a pre-planned response based on your values. Third, the identity anchor. You maintain such a clear sense of who you are that external opinions become interesting data rather than threats to your self-concept. Let me show you this in action. David, a software engineer, was constantly stressed by his demanding boss. Using Jung's boundary fortress method, David implemented an emotional firewall before work each day. He decided he would observe his boss's stress but not absorb it. He pre-selected calm professional responses to criticism, and he anchored his identity in his competence and growth, not his boss's approval. Within weeks, David reported feeling untouchable at work. His boss's moods no longer affected his performance or peace of mind. But more importantly, his boss began treating him with more respect, as if sensing David's newfound psychological strength. This is the paradox Jung described about boundary fortresses. The stronger your boundaries, the more others respect them. People can sense psychological strength and typically adjust their behavior accordingly. But Jung's most disturbing discovery about emotional impermeability involved what he called projection reversal. His immune patients had learned to see through others' emotional attacks to the psychological wounds driving them. Heinrich demonstrated this principle during one of Jung's sessions. A business rival had publicly humiliated him, calling him a heartless profiteer who cares nothing for his workers. Instead of anger or defense, Heinrich felt curiosity. Dr. Heinrich said, "This man's attack told me everything about his psychology and nothing about mine." His accusation of heartlessness revealed his own fear of being seen as unfailing. His focus on profit showed his own financial insecurity. His concern for workers exposed his guilt about his own treatment of employees. Jung realized Heinrich had mastered what he called psychological X-ray vision, the ability to see through surface attacks to underlying psychological dynamics. When someone attacks you, they're always telling you something about themselves, not you. This discovery was disturbing because it meant most human conflict was based on psychological projection. People weren't really fighting each other. They were fighting projections of their own unresolved issues onto each other. Jung documented the pattern repeatedly. Criticism about your appearance comes from people insecure about their looks. Attacks on their success come from those frustrated with their achievements. Judgments about your choices come from those doubting their own decisions. But here's what Jung found most troubling. Once you could see these projections clearly, it became almost impossible to take personal attacks personally. You started feeling compassion for the psychological pain driving others' aggression. Heinrich described this shift. "Doctor, when someone attacks me now I see a wounded child lashing out in pain. How can I be angry at a child for crying? Instead, I feel curious about what hurt them and whether I can help." This is the ultimate psychological immunity, Jung discovered. When you can see others' attacks as expressions of their pain, rather than assessments of your worth, you become completely unbothered by their behavior. The projection reversal technique involves 3 diagnostic questions. When someone attacks you, what quality are they attacking in me? Where might they struggle with the same quality? What pain or fear might be driving this attack? Let me demonstrate this with a real example. Lisa, a graphic designer, was devastated when a client called her work completely unprofessional and amateur. Using projection reversal, she asked, "What are they attacking in my professionalism? Where might they struggle with this?" She remembered the client mentioning feeling like an imposter in their industry. What pain drives this fear of their own unprofessionalism being exposed? Insight transformed Lisa's response. Instead of taking the criticism personally, she could see it as the client's projection of their own professional insecurities. She addressed their concerns professionally while maintaining her inner peace. But Jung warned about a dangerous side effect of mastering projection reversal. Once you could see through everyone's psychological defenses, maintaining genuine relationships became challenging. You might feel like you were surrounded by wounded children rather than equal adults. Heinrich experienced this isolation. "Doctor, sometimes I feel like I'm the only adult in a world of hurt children. I can see everyone's pain so clearly that I struggle to take any of their behavior seriously." Jung realized this was the price of psychological immunity, clarity about human nature that could lead to detachment from human drama. The key was learning to see others' pain without losing compassion for their experience. Jung's final discovery about emotional impermeability was perhaps the most disturbing of all. His patients hadn't just learned to avoid being triggered, they had developed what he called emotional alchemy, the ability to transform every trigger into psychological gold. Heinrich explained this process. "Doctor, I no longer see difficult people as problems to avoid. I see them as teachers bringing me exactly the lessons I need for my growth. The more someone can trigger me, the more valuable they are to my development." This represented a complete reversal of normal human psychology. Instead of avoiding triggers, Heinrich actively sought them out as opportunities for growth. Instead of seeing difficult people as enemies, he saw them as unconscious allies in his psychological development. Jung realized this was the ultimate stage of emotional impermeability, transforming every external challenge into internal advancement. His immune patients had learned to use other people's negativity as fuel for their own psychological evolution. The process Heinrich described was methodical. When triggered, instead of reacting or even just observing, he would immediately ask, "What is this person teaching me about myself? What weakness are they exposing that I need to strengthen? What shadow aspect are they forcing me to confront?" But here's what Jung found most disturbing. This level of psychological development created individuals who were nearly impossible to manipulate, control, or defeat emotionally. They had transformed every potential weakness into a source of strength. You already know this truth intuitively. External validation cannot inflate you because you don't need it. External criticism cannot deflate you because you use it for growth. You have the capacity to become emotionally invulnerable, not through armor, but through the alchemy of turning every challenge into wisdom. This emotional alchemy involved 3 transformation processes. First, trigger mining, actively extracting valuable insights from every person who disturbed your peace. Second, shadow integration, using others' behavior to identify and heal your own psychological wounds. Third, strength synthesis, converting every discovered weakness into a developed strength. Let me show you this process in action. Marcus, a sales manager, was constantly triggered by his team's laziness and excuses. Instead of just managing his reaction, he used emotional alchemy. He asked, "What is their laziness teaching me that I expect others to share my drive without understanding their motivations? What weakness does this expose? My inability to inspire rather than demand. What strength can I develop? The skill of motivating others through connection rather than pressure." Marcus transformed his trigger into a growth opportunity. He studied motivation psychology, learned to connect with his team's personal goals, and developed into one of the company's most effective leaders. His trigger became the catalyst for his greatest professional development. But Jung warned about the dark side of emotional alchemy. People who mastered it sometimes became so focused on their own growth that they lost empathy for those still struggling with basic emotional regulation. They could become psychologically superior and emotionally distant. Heinrich experienced this. Doctor. Sometimes I feel like I'm conducting a psychology experiment rather than living a human life. Every interaction becomes a chance to study human nature rather than connect with another person. Jung realized the final challenge of emotional impermeability was maintaining humanity while achieving psychological transcendence. The goal wasn't to become invulnerable but to become antifragile, stronger, and more compassionate through every challenge. As Jung wrote, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life." True immunity required accepting both strength and vulnerability. The ultimate stage of emotional alchemy involved what Jung called compassionate immunity. Using your psychological strength to help others, rather than to distance yourself from them. Heinrich eventually learned to use his immunity, not as a shield but as a bridge, helping others develop their own emotional resilience. Jung's final observations about emotional impermeability revealed its ultimate purpose: not to escape human connection, but to engage with it from a position of psychological strength. He called this stage the compassionate warrior. Someone who remained untriggered while still caring deeply about others. Heinrich's transformation into a compassionate warrior happened gradually. Initially, his immunity created distance between him and others. People found his unshakable calm unsettling, even threatening. But Jung helped him understand that true emotional immunity included the ability to make others feel safe and understood. Dr. Heinrich reflected, "I realized my immunity was incomplete if it only protected me. True strength means creating space for others to feel their emotions without judgment while maintaining my own center." Jung documented how Heinrich learned to use his emotional immunity in service of others. When his wife expressed frustration, instead of remaining unmoved, he could hold space for her feelings without absorbing them. When his employees brought him problems, he could listen with full presence without taking on their stress. This is the paradox Jung discovered about ultimate emotional immunity. It requires maintaining your humanity, not transcending it. The compassionate warrior can feel others' pain without suffering, witness others' chaos without becoming chaotic, and offer support without becoming depleted. The technique I developed from Jung's observations involved emotional aikido, using the energy of others' emotions to help them rather than resisting or absorbing that energy. When someone brings you anger, you redirect it towards solutions. When someone brings you sadness, you transform it into compassion. When someone brings you fear, you alchemize it into wisdom. Heinrich mastered this so completely that people began seeking him out during their worst emotional crisis. His presence alone seemed to calm others' inner storms. But he achieved this not through emotional detachment but through emotional mastery, feeling everything but being controlled by nothing. Jung's final notes on Heinrich revealed the ultimate secret of emotional impermeability. He has learned to love others' humanity while remaining untouchable by their chaos. This is perhaps the highest achievement of human psychology. Complete vulnerability combined with complete invulnerability. The businessman who couldn't be bothered became Jung's greatest case study in human psychological potential. Heinrich proved that emotional immunity isn't about becoming cold or detached, It's about becoming so psychologically strong that you can remain warm and connected even in the midst of others' emotional storms. Jung's disturbing discovery about people who never get angry reveals the ultimate truth about human nature. We are not victims of our emotional reactions. With the right understanding and practice, anyone can develop the psychological immunity that makes others' behavior irrelevant to your inner peace. The path Heinrich traveled from shadow integration, through boundary fortresses to emotional alchemy, and finally to compassionate warrior represents the complete journey of psychological development that Jung believed every human could achieve. Today you've learned the psychological techniques that Jung documented in his most private case studies. The shadow mirror that transforms triggers into teachers. The reaction gap that gives you choice over your responses. The boundary fortress that protects your psychological space. The projection reversal that helps you see through others' attacks. The emotional alchemy that turns every challenge into growth. And finally, the compassionate warrior that maintains humanity while achieving immunity. Jung's most disturbing discovery wasn't that some people never get angry. It was that this ability reveals the vast psychological potential latent in every human being. The question isn't whether you can develop emotional immunity. The question is whether you're ready to claim the psychological power that Jung proved belongs to you. Remember Heinrich's final insight. Doctor, I learned that true strength isn't about what can't touch you. It's about what you can touch without being changed by it. Your journey to emotional immunity starts now. Every trigger you encounter is a teacher. Every difficult person is a mirror. Every challenge is an opportunity for psychological alchemy. The only person who can disturb your peace is the person you haven't fully understood yourself. Take Jung's disturbing discovery and make it your liberating truth. You have the power to never be bothered by anyone again. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.